The following morning brought with it the sort of grey, drizzling rain that seemed to seep into one's very bones, and with it came the news that would render Eleanor's mysterious distress suddenly and dreadfully comprehensible. Dr. Timothy Nash, the distinguished physician from the neighbouring town of Ashford, had been found dead in his consulting rooms, slumped across his desk with an empty glass of whiskey beside him and a bottle of sleeping tablets on the shelf above. The official verdict, delivered with admirable efficiency by the local constabulary and the county coroner, was suicide, a conclusion that seemed to satisfy everyone except Miss Marple, who learned of the death while taking her mid-morning tea with her old friend, Mrs. Hartley, the vicar's wife. The news had been delivered by the postman himself, Timothy Prescott, who could barely contain his excitement at being the bearer of such momentous information, and who related the details with the breathless enthusiasm of one who had suddenly found himself possessed of genuine importance. Miss Marple had listened with her usual composed attention, her knitting needles continuing their rhythmic click, click, click without pause, though her eyes had sharpened considerably when Mrs. Hartley had mentioned, almost in passing, that Dr. Nash had been Eleanor Pemberton's personal physician for the better part of 20 years. The connection, once made, seemed to illuminate everything with a kind of terrible clarity. Eleanor had received her letter on Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon her long-time physician was dead, ruled a suicide by a coroner who had known him only by reputation. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care and asked Mrs. Hartley, with the apparent casualness of idle conversation, whether she happened to know what Dr. Nash's particular specialties might have been. Mrs. Hartley, never the most observant of women, had merely replied that he was a general practitioner of some repute, though she believed he had a particular interest in women's health matters, having treated most of the respectable ladies in the district. It was this final detail that seemed to crystallize something in Miss Marple's mind, though she revealed nothing of her thoughts, merely nodding thoughtfully and returning to her knitting as though the matter were of no consequence whatsoever. By evening the village was awash with speculation and rumour. The death of Dr. Nash, particularly under such circumstances, had provided the community with a topic of conversation that far exceeded even Eleanor's unexplained distress in terms of dramatic potential. At the White Hart public house, men gathered to discuss theories ranging from financial ruin to romantic entanglement, each supposition more elaborate and less grounded in fact than the last. At the ladies' circle at St. Mary Church, the mood was one of hushed horror mixed with barely concealed fascination. Margaret Castleton, still employed at the post office, had mentioned to several patrons that she had seen Dr. Nash arriving at the manor on at least 3 occasions within the past month, a detail that had been seized upon and transformed into something far more sinister than its original innocuous appearance might suggest. Eleanor herself had retreated entirely from public view, her usual social obligations cancelled, her household staff given instructions to turn away visitors. Only her solicitor, Mr. Henry Blackwood, had continued to visit the manor with increasing frequency, each visit lasting longer than the last, each departure accompanied by the sort of grim expression that suggested discussions of considerable seriousness. It was on the 3rd day following Dr. Nash's death that Miss Marple took it upon herself to visit Eleanor, a decision that surprised no one in the village, as Miss Marple was known for her conscientious attention to the welfare of her acquaintances, particularly during times of distress. She arrived at the manor in the early afternoon, her small, elderly frame wrapped in a sensible grey coat and accompanied by a basket containing homemade biscuits and a pot of her celebrated restorative broth. Eleanor received her in the drawing-room, though received was perhaps too generous a term for the encounter. Eleanor looked as though she had aged 10 years since last Miss Marple had seen her, her face drawn and grey, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted her visitor's offerings. Miss Marple settled herself into a comfortable chair, with the air of someone prepared to remain for a considerable time, and she began to speak, in her gentle, almost rambling manner, about the shocking nature of Dr. Nash's death, about the terrible burden of unresolved secrets, about the way that silence often compounds tragedy rather than mitigating it. She spoke of a case she had observed many years before in St. Mary Mead, involving a woman who had kept a dangerous secret to protect her reputation, only to find that the keeping of it had destroyed everything and everyone she held dear. Eleanor listened to these musings with increasing agitation, her fingers twisting together in her lap, her eyes fixed on some point beyond Miss Marple's line of sight, and when finally Miss Marple paused in her narrative to take a sip of tea, Eleanor suddenly broke into tears, not the restrained, dignified tears of a woman of her station, but great, gasping sobs that seemed to wrench themselves from the very depths of her being. Miss Marple said nothing, asked nothing, merely continued to knit with patient steadiness while Eleanor's storm of emotion passed over her like a tempest passing over still water. When finally Eleanor had regained some measure of composure, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief that Miss Marple provided, the older woman remarked, almost absently, that secrets had a curious way of becoming far heavier when carried alone, and that sometimes the unburdening of them, though terribly painful, offered a kind of liberation that no amount of silence could ever achieve. Eleanor did not respond directly, but in the silence that followed, both women understood that something fundamental had shifted, and that the true nature of the mystery that had begun with a letter and continued with a death was about to be revealed at last. Eleanor's confession began with a whispered admission that seemed to cost her an enormous effort, as though each word were being extracted from some deep and painful place within her soul. She had, she said, received a letter from Dr. Nash demanding money, a considerable sum, in exchange for his silence regarding a certain medical matter of an extremely delicate nature. The letter had been written in his precise clinical hand, and it had contained enough specific detail to make clear that he possessed knowledge that could utterly devastate her family's reputation. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her knitting needles continuing their steady rhythm, her expression one of attentive compassion rather than judgment. When Eleanor paused, struggling to find words for matters that proper ladies did not discuss, Miss Marple gently supplied the missing context by asking, with her characteristic directness masked in gentle inquiry, whether the matter concerned itself with something related to Victoria's health some years before. Eleanor had stared at her visitor with astonishment, her tear-stained face registering both relief and horror that someone else should know, should have guessed, the shameful secret that had haunted her for nearly a decade. The story that emerged was neither uncommon nor truly scandalous when examined without the lens of social convention. Victoria, some 9 years prior, had been seduced by a young man of dubious character, a guest at the manor whose family connections had seemed respectable enough at the time. The relationship had progressed beyond what propriety allowed, and Victoria had found herself with child, a situation that had threatened to destroy not only her own prospects, but the standing of her entire family within the county society that valued reputation above almost all else. Eleanor had intervened with her usual decisiveness, securing the services of Dr. Nash, who had arranged for a discreet solution in a private nursing home in Switzerland. The young man had been sent abroad, Victoria had recovered both physically and emotionally, and the matter had been buried beneath layers of careful silence and social maneuvering. No one in Thornbury Village had ever known. Victoria herself had developed the capacity to speak of those months as though they had never truly occurred. But Dr. Nash, it seemed, had never quite forgotten the leverage he possessed, and in his declining years, facing what he perceived as financial difficulties, he had determined to convert that leverage into ready cash. Eleanor had refused his demands, her initial response consisting of a brief and cutting letter informing him that she would not be blackmailed and that she would instead expose him to the medical board for his breach of professional ethics. But this defiance had soon given way to anxiety, then to desperation, as Dr. Nash had made increasingly explicit threats, suggesting that he would write to the local newspaper, that he would inform Eleanor's husband, that he would ensure that the entire county became aware of Victoria's shame. It was at this juncture that Lena had sought the counsel of Mr. Blackwood, the solicitor, whose legal expertise had proven unhelpful against the weapon of social humiliation. And then, quite suddenly, Dr. Nash had died, his suicide making clear to Eleanor that he had perhaps been more unstable than she had realized, that his financial difficulties were more severe than she had understood, and that fate, in its mysterious way, had intervened to spare her family the threatened exposure. She had received the final communication from Dr. Nash, a brief note written in an unsteady hand, only hours before his body had been discovered. A note in which he had written, with surprising clarity, that he could no longer bear the burden of his own moral failures and that he was choosing to end his life rather than face the consequences of his actions. Miss Marple sat in silence for a long moment after Eleanor finished speaking, her knitting needles finally stilling in her lap. She asked, with genuine gentleness, whether Eleanor had mentioned any of these details to the authorities investigating Dr. Nash's death. Eleanor's answer was a vehement negative. She had destroyed the blackmail letter and all subsequent correspondence, and she had resolved that Dr. Nash's death, whatever its true nature, would serve as an endpoint to the entire sordid affair. The authorities were satisfied with the suicide verdict. Victoria would be protected, and Eleanor could begin the process of putting the matter behind her. But as she spoke these words, Eleanor's eyes betrayed her uncertainty, and Miss Marple perceived in that uncertainty something that Eleanor herself had perhaps not yet fully articulated, that suicide, while convenient, seemed somehow at odds with Dr. Nash's character, as Eleanor had described him. A man motivated by greed and self-interest, hardly the sort to relinquish his leverage through death. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the careful deliberation of age, and she placed a weathered hand gently upon Eleanor's shoulder. She observed, with the kind of innocent musing that had become her trademark, that it was interesting how sometimes the most obvious explanation for events could sometimes obscure a far more complicated truth. She suggested, as a purely hypothetical matter, that sometimes individuals who possessed knowledge of others' secrets might find themselves targets for retribution from those who sought to protect those very secrets. She wondered aloud whether Eleanor had considered the possibility that someone else, someone close to Eleanor, someone with as much to lose as Eleanor herself, might have taken matters into their own hands. Eleanor's face had gone quite white during this speech, and when Miss Marple finished speaking, Eleanor understood with perfect clarity that Miss Marple was not merely offering comfort or absolution, but rather was suggesting a line of inquiry that neither of them could afford to pursue directly, at least not yet. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding, and in that silence both women recognized that the death of Dr. Nash, convenient as it might be, was likely far from the conclusion they had hoped it would represent. The afternoon had advanced considerably by the time Miss Marple departed from Brackendale Manor, her basket now considerably lighter, having left behind her restorative offerings and taken with her a far heavier burden of knowledge. She walked through the drizzling rain with the same unhurried pace she had maintained for decades, her mind occupied with the careful process of examining the threads of this increasingly complicated tapestry. Eleanor's revelation had answered certain questions, while simultaneously raising others of considerably greater significance, and Miss Marple understood that. The narrative she had been presented with, while containing elements of truth, was incomplete. She had observed during her visit that Victoria had appeared only briefly, emerging from the morning room with an expression of carefully controlled anxiety, before hastily retreating when she perceived her mother's guest. More telling still was the absence of Sir Frederick, Eleanor's husband, a man who typically spent his afternoons at the manor attending to matters of estate management. His absence, combined with Eleanor's evident distress and her apparent decision to confide in Miss Marple rather than in her own spouse, suggested layers of domestic complication that went far beyond the relatively straightforward matter of blackmail and threatened exposure. By the time Miss Marple arrived home at her cottage on the village green, she had already begun the process of reconstructing events with the meticulous attention to detail that had served her so well in previous investigations. She settled herself in her sitting room with a pot of tea and her ever-present knitting, and she allowed her mind to wander backward through the chronology of events as they had been presented to her. Dr. Nash's demand for money had apparently been made in writing, suggesting that he possessed sufficient confidence in his leverage to commit his intentions to paper. But this same confidence had apparently not extended to ensuring that the recipient of his demands would comply, nor had it encompassed any apparent contingency plan should Eleanor prove recalcitrant. This lack of caution seemed inconsistent with the behavior of a man who had successfully maintained his silence about Victoria's situation for nearly a decade. Such silence required patience, discretion, and a certain cunning. It seemed unlikely that a man possessed of these qualities would suddenly become reckless in his approach to Exeter. The question of Dr. Nash's suicide presented itself with increasing insistence. The official narrative held that he had taken his own life due to financial pressures and, presumably, the weight of his own moral failures. Yet Eleanor's account suggested that Dr. Nash had responded to her defiance not with despair, but with escalating threats and demands. This progression did not align with the behavior of someone contemplating self-termination. Rather, it suggested an individual who remained engaged in his scheme, who believed himself capable of ultimate success. The final note that Eleanor had mentioned, the one written in an unsteady hand and expressing remorse for his moral failures, might well have been genuine, or it might have been something else entirely, something crafted to support a particular narrative while obscuring a rather different truth. Miss Marple's thoughts turned next to the matter of Victoria, a young woman whose entire life had been shaped by a single moment of youthful indiscretion and whose future prospects had been built upon foundations of silence and secrecy. What must it have been like for Victoria to carry such a burden, to know that her entire social position, her marriage prospects, her standing within the community rested upon the continued discretion of a man who had recently demonstrated himself willing to compromise that discretion for financial gain? And what of Sir Frederick, who presumably did not know the true nature of the crisis that was consuming his wife and threatening his daughter's future? Miss Marple had observed, during her years in St. Mary Mead, that silence within families often bred more damage than the truth ever could, and that when secrets began to crack and crumble, the collateral damage extended far beyond the individual most directly implicated in the original transgression. As evening descended upon the village, Miss Marple put aside her knitting and composed a brief note to Mr. Blackwood, the solicitor, requesting a meeting at his office the following morning on a matter of some delicacy. She did not specify the nature of her concerns, having long ago learned that precision in such matters often led to resistance or evasion. Instead, she employed language sufficiently vague to intrigue without alarming, suggesting only that she had information regarding the circumstances surrounding Dr. Nash's death that might be of interest to him from a legal standpoint. She had the note delivered by hand that evening, knowing that it would arrive at Blackwood's residence and that he would, out of professional curiosity if nothing else, honor her request. Meanwhile, in the Manor's dining room, a distinctly uncomfortable family dinner was taking place. Sir Frederick, recently returned from London where he had been attending to business matters, had noticed his wife's evident distress and had been attempting, with typical masculine directness, to extract an explanation. Eleanor had deflected his inquiries with increasing desperation, and Victoria had sat in silence, her food largely untouched, her eyes fixed upon her plate with the intensity of one studying ancient texts. The tension at the table was palpable, a living thing that seemed to press against all three of them with accumulating weight. Sir Frederick, sensing that something of significance was being withheld from him, had begun to grow angry, his voice taking on that particular quality it adopted when he felt himself being excluded from matters that directly affected his household. And in that moment, with anger replacing confusion, Victoria had suddenly risen from the table, excused herself with barely controlled composure, and left the room, leaving her parents to contemplate the growing chasm that had opened between the morning following Victoria's precipitous departure from the dinner table dawned with a peculiar quality of stillness that seemed to pervade Brackendale Manor, and indeed the entire village of Thornbury. Miss Marple's appointment with Mr. Blackwood had been scheduled for 10:30, and she arrived at his office in the High Street with her customary punctuality, noting as she passed through the village that an unusual number of people seemed to be engaged in animated conversation near the post office. She filed away this observation for later consideration and presented herself at the solicitor's door, where she was immediately admitted by his clerk, a nervous young man who seemed to be laboring under some considerable anxiety. Blackwood himself rose from behind his desk as Miss Marple entered, his expression one of barely concealed curiosity, and he gestured her toward a comfortable chair while simultaneously closing the door with perhaps more deliberation than the gesture strictly required. Miss Marple settled herself with the deliberate movements of advancing age, and she began her narrative not with direct accusations or specific allegations, but rather with a series of observations phrased as innocent musings about the nature of human motivation and the ways in which individuals respond when confronted with threats to their most fundamental interests. She observed that a young woman of Victoria's position and character would naturally experience considerable distress if she feared that her past indiscretions might become public knowledge, and that this distress might well manifest itself in ways that rational individuals might not immediately recognize as connected to its source. She wondered aloud about the particular vulnerability of daughters to their mother's protective instincts and about the lengths to which protective mothers might go when faced threats to their children's futures. And then, with a gentle shift in her tone, she inquired whether Mr. Blackwood had, in his professional capacity, observed any evidence that the matter of Dr. Nash's blackmail might have extended beyond Eleanor's knowledge, or whether there might have been communications or arrangements made by other members of the household. Blackwood's face had grown progressively more rigid as Miss Marple spoke, and when she finished her inquiry, he sat in silence for a considerable time before finally rising and walking to the window, where he stood with his back to his visitor, his hands clasped tightly before him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality of profound weariness, as though he had been waiting for this conversation and simultaneously dreading its arrival. He confirmed, with the careful precision of a man trained in legal language, that Eleanor had indeed consulted with him regarding Dr. Nash's demands, and that her initial intention had been to refuse them outright. However, he continued, Eleanor had subsequently informed him that she had decided to comply with the doctor's demands, not because she believed compliance would bring the matter to a conclusion, but because she had determined that paying the blackmail was preferable to the alternative. When Miss Marple asked what alternative Eleanor had been contemplating, Blackwood had turned from the window and looked directly at his elderly visitor, and in that look Miss Marple perceived the answer even before he articulated it. Blackwood had become concerned, he explained, when Eleanor had spoken with a particular kind of resignation about the matter, as though she had arrived at some form of resolution that extended far beyond the simple payment of money. He had questioned her with increasing directness, but Eleanor had remained evasive, speaking only in vague terms, about ensuring that Dr. Nash would never again pose a threat to her family. It was only later, when Dr. Nash's death had been reported, and when Blackwood had observed Eleanor's reaction to the news, a reaction that he described as one of relief tinged with something far more complicated, that he had begun to suspect what Eleanor might have been suggesting without explicitly stating. He had made discreet inquiries regarding the circumstances of Dr. Nash's death, but the authorities had been remarkably thorough in their investigation, and the evidence all pointed toward a straightforward case of suicide, motivated by financial desperation and moral remorse. Miss Marple listened to this account with her customary attentiveness, and when Blackwood had finished, she posed a question that seemed almost tangential to the matter at hand. Had Eleanor, during any of their conversations, mentioned the names of anyone else who might have been aware of the blackmail situation? Blackwood's response was cautious, but eventually he acknowledged that Eleanor had mentioned that Victoria knew of Dr. Nash's demands, and that Victoria had expressed her own distress regarding the threat to the family's reputation. Moreover, Eleanor had indicated that Sir Frederick remained ignorant of the matter, a state of affairs that Eleanor considered preferable given her husband's tendency toward overreaction to matters that affected his family's honor. Miss Marple absorbed this information with a gentle nod, and she rose to take her leave, thanking Blackwood for his candor and his trust in her discretion. As she moved toward the door, she paused and turned back, and with the air of someone remembering a minor detail, she asked whether Blackwood had any knowledge of Sir Frederick's movements on the afternoon that Dr. Nash had died. The solicitor's hesitation before responding was itself a form of answer, and when he finally spoke, his words came slowly and with evident reluctance. He had, he said, encountered Sir Frederick in the town some distance away on the afternoon in question, and Sir Frederick had appeared agitated and distressed, though when questioned he had offered only vague explanations about business matters. Blackwood had thought little of it at the time, but in light of subsequent events, he had begun to wonder whether Sir Frederick had perhaps learned of Dr. Nash's demands and had taken matters into his own hands. Miss Marple's expression remained composed, but her eyes had sharpened considerably, and she departed the solicitor's office with the kind of purposeful gentleness that those who knew her well recognized as indicative of significant developments in her understanding of events. The afternoon found Miss Marple seated in the small sitting-room of the vicarage, engaged in what appeared to be nothing more than casual conversation with Mrs. Hartley regarding the upcoming church bazaar and the various tasks that required completion before the event could proceed. However, beneath this veneer of domestic triviality, Miss Marple was engaged in the rather more delicate business of extracting information about the village's comings and goings on the day of Dr. Nash's death. Mrs. Hartley, always eager to demonstrate her awareness of village happenings, had proven remarkably forthcoming regarding the movements of various residents, and it was through her gossiping that Miss Marple learned a detail of considerable significance. Dr. Nash's motor car had been observed departing his consulting rooms in the late afternoon, driven not by Dr. Nash himself, but by what appeared to be a gentleman of middle years and substantial build. The person who had provided this observation was Mrs. Hartley's own sister-in-law, who had been passing the consulting rooms at precisely the moment the motor car had emerged from the drive. This revelation shifted the entire framework of Miss Marple's understanding, for it suggested that the narrative of suicide, while convenient and officially sanctioned, might have been constructed on a foundation of deliberate misdirection. If someone other than Dr. Nash had been driving his motor car in the afternoon of his death, then the question of who had actually died in his consulting rooms became suddenly and urgently relevant. Miss Marple posed a series of seemingly innocent questions about the description of the man who had driven the motor car, extracting details about his approximate age, his bearing, and the quality of his clothing. Mrs. Hartley had, unfortunately, been unable to observe him with sufficient clarity to provide a definitive identification, but she had mentioned that the individual had appeared to be someone of consequence, someone accustomed to command, and that his posture had suggested a man laboring under considerable emotional strain. By the time Miss Marple departed the vicarage, the outlines of a profoundly disturbing possibility had begun to crystallize in her mind. It seemed increasingly likely that Dr. Nash had not taken his own life at all, but rather that someone had arranged for his death and had subsequently manipulated the evidence to suggest suicide. The question that remained was whether this arrangement had been made by Sir Frederick, acting to protect his family's honor and his daughter's future, or whether it represented something far more complicated, a conspiracy involving multiple parties, each motivated by different but overlapping concerns. Miss Marple understood that the time had come to move beyond the passive accumulation of information and to take a more active role in testing her emerging hypotheses against the reactions and responses of the individu. ALS most closely implicated in the events under investigation. She made her way to the manor in the late afternoon, timed with deliberate precision to ensure that the household would be at leisure and that she might find Victoria alone or in circumstances where genuine conversation might prove possible. She was not disappointed in this calculation. Victoria was indeed in the drawing-room, engaged in the rather futile activity of attempting to read a novel whose contents seemed to hold no interest for her whatsoever. She looked up with evident surprise at Miss Marple's arrival, and there was something in her expression, a kind of desperate hope mixed with profound apprehension, that suggested she had been anticipating a visitor, though perhaps not this particular one. Miss Marple settled herself into a chair with her characteristic deliberation, and she began to speak about the curious nature of family loyalty and the ways in which daughters often find themselves bearing the weight of their parents' protective impulses, even when such protection has taken on forms that the daughters themselves would never have chosen. Victoria's hands had begun to tremble as Miss Marple spoke, and when the older woman inquired with gentle directness whether Victoria had known of her father's intention to resolve the matter of Dr. Nash's blackmail, Victoria's entire composure seemed to crumble. The girl had risen from her chair and walked to the window, her back to her visitor, and she had begun to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. She had overheard, she said, a conversation between her parents the evening before Dr. Nash's death, a conversation in which Sir Frederick had determined that the blackmail could not be allowed to continue, that the threat to his family's honor was intolerable, and that he would ensure the threat was permanently eliminated. Victoria had assumed, in her youthful naivete, that her father meant merely to confront Dr. Nash, to threaten him with exposure to the medical board, to employ the weapons of social and professional destruction that were available to a man of Sir Frederick's standing. She had not imagined, could not have imagined, that her father might have intended something far more final and irreversible. When Dr. Nash had subsequently died, Victoria had been forced to contemplate the dreadful possibility that her father had acted upon his determination in ways that extended far beyond what she had ever intended to encourage or support. She had observed her father's behavior in the days following Dr. Nash's death with increasing horror, noting his attempts to appear normal despite the evident strain he was laboring under, his careful avoidance of any discussion of the matter, his almost desperate efforts to resume his ordinary routines. Victoria had wanted to confront him, to demand the truth, but she had been paralyzed by the terrible knowledge that the truth, if it confirmed her worst suspicions, would destroy not only her father but her entire family. It was this paralysis, this inability to act on her knowledge while simultaneously being consumed by it, that had finally erupted at the dinner table in her precipitous departure from the room. She had reached a point of absolute crisis, she told Miss Marple, where the burden of secrecy had become literally unbearable, and she had determined that she could no longer maintain silence regarding what she suspected her father might have done. Miss Marple allowed Victoria's confession to hang in the air between them for several long moments before responding, recognizing that sometimes silence itself served as a form of compassionate acknowledgement. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the ways in which human beings struggled with the terrible consequences of their own actions and the actions of those they loved. She posed to Victoria a question that seemed almost rhetorical in nature. Had Victoria actually witnessed her father commit any act that would constitute murder, or was she rather operating from inference and suspicion born of anxiety regarding what her father might be capable of doing? Victoria's answer, when it came, was reluctant and qualified, for in truth, she had no direct evidence of her father's involvement in Dr. Nash's death, only the terrible conviction that his stated intention to eliminate the threat had somehow manifested itself into reality. Miss Marple rose and approached the window where Victoria stood, and she placed a weathered hand upon the younger woman's shoulder, with a gesture that conveyed both compassion and a kind of steady reassurance. She suggested, with the gentle wisdom that came from decades of observing human nature, that Victoria consider the possibility that her father's words, spoken in anger and emotional distress, might not have been intended as a literal plan of action. She observed that men, when confronted with threats to their family's honor, often speak with a kind of hyperbolic intensity, that their words do not accurately reflect their genuine intentions. Moreover, Miss Marple continued, Victoria had allowed her own guilt regarding the original indiscretion to shape her interpretation of her father's statements, investing them with significance that they might not actually possess. This suggestion seemed to offer Victoria a glimmer of hope, and yet her expression remained troubled, for she understood that hope built upon denial was itself a form of deception that could not sustain itself indefinitely. It was at this precise moment that Sir Frederick himself arrived in the drawing-room, his unexpected appearance clear, surprising both Victoria and Miss Marple, though the older woman recovered her composure with admirable speed. Sir Frederick was a man of perhaps 60 years, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and the physical appearance of a man who had spent much of his life engaged in vigorous pursuits. However, his eyes carried a quality of deep exhaustion, and there was something in his expression that suggested he had been laboring under considerable mental and emotional strain. He greeted Miss Marple with the formal courtesy that his station demanded, though his eyes moved between his daughter and his elderly visitor, with evident concern regarding what conversation might have been taking place in his absence. Miss Marple, with her characteristic directness masked in gentle inquiry, suggested that perhaps it would be beneficial for all parties if Sir Frederick were to join them, as there appeared to be certain matters of family concern that required discussion and clarification. Sir Frederick's immediate defensive response, a tightening of his jaw and a subtle shift in his posture, suggested to Miss Marple that he understood precisely what matters Miss Marple was alluding to. What followed was a conversation of extraordinary delicacy, conducted with a care that reflected not merely social convention, but the profound understanding that the words being exchanged had the potential to either heal or irreparably fracture the bonds that held this family together. Sir Frederick, confronted with the reality that his intentions were known and his movements observed, initially attempted to maintain a facade of ignorance regarding the matters under discussion. However, as Miss Marple calmly related the observations she had made and the information she had gathered, this facade gradually crumbled, and he was forced to acknowledge that he had indeed visited Dr. Nash on the afternoon of his death. But his purpose, he insisted with genuine emotion, had been neither murderous nor even violent. He had intended only to confront the doctor, to threaten him with exposure and legal action, to make clear that the blackmail would not be tolerated and that the consequences of persisting in his demands would be severe. Sir Frederick had, according to his account, found Dr. Nash in an extremely agitated state, the man speaking in a distraught manner about financial ruin and the collapse of his respectable practice. The doctor had been drinking, Sir Frederick observed, and he had been in possession of a bottle of sleeping tablets and a glass of whiskey, suggesting that he had already begun to contemplate his own demise even before Sir Frederick's arrival. When Sir Frederick had threatened him with exposure to the medical board and to the authorities, Dr. Nash had become even more distressed, speaking in increasingly disconnected language about the futility of his situation and the inevitability of his downfall. Sir Frederick had attempted to leave the consulting rooms, believing that further conversation would prove counterproductive, and in departing, he had observed Dr. Nash replacing the glass to his lips with an expression of grim resignation. Sir Frederick had departed in Dr. Nash's motor car only because the doctor had insisted upon it, offering the vehicle's use as a means of demonstrating his acceptance of the confrontation that had taken place. He had driven it a considerable distance before abandoning it in a remote location where it would not be immediately discovered, and he had then secured transport back to Thornbury through various circuitous means designed to avoid observation. He had acted in this manner, he explained, not because he had killed Dr. Nash, but because he had feared that his presence at the consulting rooms immediately prior to the doctor's death might appear suspicious to investigating authorities, and he had sought to protect his family from the scandal that such suspicion might generate. As Sir Frederick concluded his explanation, Miss Marple studied his face with the careful attention of someone attempting to discern truth from falsehood in the subtle languages of expression and gesture. The question that remained, she understood with sudden and terrible clarity, was whether Sir Frederick's account represented the actual sequence of events, or whether it constituted a carefully constructed narrative designed to obscure a rather different and far more sinister truth. The evening that followed Sir Frederick's confession brought with it a peculiar quality of suspended animation, as though the household of Bracondale Manor had been placed in a state of temporary stasis while awaiting the revelation that would determine the trajectory of all their futures. Miss Marple had departed the manor with a promise to return the following morning, having excused herself with the explanation that she required time to reflect upon the matters that had been disclosed to her, and that further conversation would benefit from the clarity that sleep and contemplation might provide. In truth, however, Miss Marple's departure had been prompted not by a genuine need for rest, but by a recognition that certain developments required investigation beyond the confines of the manor itself, and that she could not pursue these investigations while remaining a guest within Eleanor's household. She had spent the evening in her cottage, engaged in a series of telephone conversations conducted with a discretion that her housekeeper found remarkable, and by the time she retired for the night, she had accumulated a body of information that substantially altered her understanding of the events surrounding Dr. Nash's death. What Miss Marple had discovered through careful inquiry conducted with individuals positioned to possess relevant knowledge was that Dr. Nash's financial circumstances had indeed been considerably more dire than Sir Frederick's account had suggested, but that the source of his financial distress was not the simple matter of overspending or poor investment that the doctor had claimed. Rather, Dr. Nash had been engaged in a prolonged and increasingly expensive affair with a woman of considerably lower social station, and he had been providing her with financial support in a manner that constituted a significant drain upon his resources. More intriguingly still, this woman had recently terminated their relationship, apparently having developed an interest in another gentleman of greater financial prospects, and Dr. Nash had responded to this abandonment with a degree of emotional volatility that had alarmed those who knew him. His colleagues in the medical profession had begun to observe signs of what they delicately termed mental instability, and several had expressed concern regarding his fitness to continue practicing medicine. It was against this background of accumulating personal and professional crisis that Dr. Nash had made his demand for blackmail money from Eleanor Pemberton, a demand that seemed less a calculated scheme for profit and more a desperate grasp at resources that might somehow allow him to regain control of his deteriorating circumstances. By morning, Miss Marple had constructed a revised understanding of events that suggested possibilities far more complex than either the official verdict of suicide or Sir Frederick's account of a simple confrontation could encompass. She had also recognized a significant gap in the narrative that had been presented to her. Eleanor's account of Dr. Nash's final communication had mentioned a note written in an unsteady hand, expressing remorse and resignation. But Miss Marple had not actually observed this note herself, and she had only Eleanor's description of its contents. This absence of direct evidence, combined with the curious fact that the authorities had reported finding the note but had not made its contents public, suggested to Miss Marple that certain information regarding the manner of Dr. Nash's death had been deliberately withheld from public knowledge, and possibly even from the initial investigation itself. When Miss Marple returned to Brackendale Manor the following morning, she found the household in a state of considerable agitation. Eleanor had apparently spent the night in a state of profound anxiety, and Sir Frederick had departed early to consult once again with Mr. Blackwood regarding the legal implications of his presence at Dr. Nash's consulting rooms on the day of the doctor's death. Victoria remained in her room, ostensibly indisposed, though the servants whispered that she had been engaged in a prolonged conversation with her mother throughout the previous evening, a conversation whose tone had suggested considerable emotional turmoil. It was Eleanor herself who received Miss Marple in the drawing-room, and the transformation in the older woman's appearance was striking. Eleanor looked as though she had aged years in the span of mere hours, her face drawn and grey, her hands trembling with a palsy that seemed to reflect not merely physical exhaustion but emotional devastation. Miss Marple settled herself with her customary deliberation, and she posed to Eleanor a question that seemed almost casual in its phrasing, yet carried considerable weight beneath its apparent simplicity. Had Eleanor, in fact, destroyed the blackmail letter that Dr. Nash had sent her, or had she perhaps preserved it, recognizing that such a document might eventually prove valuable as evidence of the doctor's criminal intent? Eleanor's reaction to this inquiry was instantaneous and revealing. Her face flushed with color, and she began to speak with a kind of desperate urgency, explaining that she had indeed retained the letter, that she had felt unable to destroy it despite her initial declarations to the contrary, and that the document remained concealed in her private papers. Moreover, Eleanor continued, there was another matter that she had not previously disclosed, a matter that had only recently come to light as a consequence of Victoria's emotional collapse. On the afternoon that Dr. Nash had died, Eleanor herself had visited his consulting rooms, arriving some hours before Sir Frederick's visit, and she had been present when the doctor had made explicit threats regarding his intention to expose Victoria's shame if his financial demands were not met within a specific time frame. Eleanor's voice had become barely audible as she continued her confession, and when she finally articulated the revelation that Miss Marple had already begun to suspect, her words seemed to carry the weight of absolute devastation. She had Eleanor said, in the heat of her emotional response to Dr. Nash's threats, struck out at him in a moment of overwhelming protective fury, and he had fallen, striking his head upon the corner of a desk. She had been horrified, terrified, uncertain whether she had killed him or merely injured him, and she had fled the consulting rooms in a state of shock. When Dr. Nash's death had subsequently been reported as suicide, Eleanor had experienced a complex mixture of relief and horror, understanding that fate had apparently absolved her of the consequences of her actions, while simultaneously bearing the terrible burden of knowing that she was, in a very real sense, responsible for the doctor's death, regardless of the official determination. The confession that Eleanor had just articulated hung in the air of the drawing room like a physical presence, and Miss Marple found herself contemplating the profound moral and legal implications of what had been disclosed. She recognized, with the clarity that came from her years of observation, that Eleanor's account contained elements of truth, but was itself incomplete, shaped by the guilt and anxiety that had consumed the older woman in the days following Dr. Nash's death. Miss Marple rose from her chair. N.D. moved to the window, adopting a posture of apparent contemplation while her mind engaged in the intricate process of separating fact from emotional interpretation, of distinguishing between what Eleanor believed to have occurred and what had actually transpired. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quality of gentle but inexorable authority that compelled Eleanor's attention with the force of inevitability. Miss Marple began by acknowledging that Eleanor had indeed visited Dr. Nash's consulting rooms on the afternoon of his death, and that she had indeed been present during his threats regarding Victoria's exposure. However, Miss Marple suggested, with the kind of psychological precision that characterized her investigations, Eleanor's account of striking the doctor and causing him to fall seemed somewhat inconsistent with the physical evidence that would necessarily have accompanied such an action. The consulting room, Miss Marple observed, would have borne marks of struggle, signs of disturbance, and Eleanor herself would have been substantially disheveled and quite likely marked by evidence of the altercation. Yet Eleanor had been observed by the village postman departing the consulting rooms in a state of emotional agitation, but not physical disarray, and no such evidence of struggle had been reported by the police investigation. This discrepancy suggested to Miss Marple that Eleanor had indeed struck Dr. Nash, but perhaps not with sufficient force to cause the death that had ultimately occurred, and that Eleanor's guilt regarding her own violent impulse had led her to misinterpret the subsequent sequence of events. Eleanor's face had become increasingly pale as Miss Marple articulated these observations, and when the older woman posed the next question, Eleanor seemed to understand that the moment of genuine revelation had arrived. Miss Marple asked, "Why?" The directness that belied her usual circumlocution. What had occurred after Eleanor had struck Dr. Nash, and whether Eleanor had remained in the consulting rooms long enough to observe what the doctor had done in response to the violence that had been directed toward him. Eleanor's subsequent silence was more eloquent than any words could have been, and when she finally responded, her voice was barely audible, a mere whisper that seemed to acknowledge both the truth of Miss Marple's insight and the terrible knowledge that Eleanor had been carrying alone for days. Eleanor had indeed struck Dr. Nash, she confirmed, but the doctor had not fallen as she had described. Instead, he had stood for a moment, seemingly stunned by the blow, and then he had moved toward his desk with a kind of grim purposefulness that had filled Eleanor with a dread that transcended even her immediate horror at what she had done. Dr. Nash had retrieved the bottle of sleeping tablets from the shelf, Eleanor continued, and he had poured a substantial quantity into a glass, adding whiskey with an expression that suggested he had been contemplating this precise action even before Eleanor's arrival. He had looked directly at Eleanor and had spoken words that would haunt her forever. He had said that if he was to be struck down by a woman protecting her daughter's reputation, then perhaps the universe was sending him a message regarding the futility of his existence, and that he might as well spare everyone further difficulty by drawing his torment to a conclusion. Eleanor had attempted to intervene to prevent him from consuming the lethal combination of substances, but Dr. Nash had moved away from her with surprising agility for a man of his age, and he had consumed the contents of the glass before Eleanor could physically prevent him. She had stood in helpless horror as the doctor had returned to his chair and had begun to write the note that would later be discovered. A note in which he had attributed his decision to his financial failures and his moral shortcomings, making no mention of Eleanor's visit or the blow that she had struck. Miss Marple's expression remained composed as she listened to this account, though her eyes had taken on a particular quality of intensity that suggested she was processing information at multiple levels simultaneously. She posed to Eleanor a question that seemed almost conversational in tone. Had Eleanor considered the possibility that Dr. Nash had deliberately chosen this moment to end his life, and that Eleanor's visit and her violent response to his threats had provided him with the external validation for a decision that he had likely already made? In other words, Miss Marple continued gently, had Eleanor perhaps misinterpreted the sequence of causality, assigning herself responsibility for Dr. Nash's death, when in fact his death had been the inevitable conclusion of his own internal psychological trajectory, merely accelerated and shaped by Eleanor's presence? Eleanor's response to this suggestion was a torrent of conflicting emotions, relief and guilt and horror, all mingling together in her expression as she struggled to comprehend the possibility that her culpability might be fundamentally different from what she had believed. Miss Marple, with the compassion that characterized her approach to the human predicament, explained that the question of moral responsibility was considerably more complex than the simple matter of legal guilt. Eleanor had not murdered Dr. Nash. She had not deliberately poisoned him or engineered his death. However, Eleanor had struck him in anger, and her violence had occurred within a context that Dr. Nash had apparently interpreted as confirmation of his worthlessness and the hopelessness of high situation. The moral weight of this understanding was substantial, Miss Marple observed, but it was not the weight of intentional murder, and Eleanor's continued silence regarding the matter would serve no one, least of all the cause of justice. The afternoon that followed Eleanor's fuller confession brought with it a quality of cautious clarity, as though the household had been lifted from beneath a heavy weight and could at last breathe with something approximating normal rhythm. Miss Marple had spent considerable time with Eleanor, discussing not merely the legal implications of her involvement in Dr. Nash's death, but the deeper psychological and moral dimensions that extended far beyond the purview of criminal law. She had explained, with the gentleness that characterized her approach to human suffering, that while Eleanor's blow had been struck in anger and had caused Dr. Nash physical pain, it had not directly caused his death. Rather, it had served as the final confirmation to a man already determined upon self-destruction that his existence was so offensive to the world that even a woman of Eleanor's gentle nature had been driven to violence in response to his behavior. This distinction, though subtle, carried significant weight in the calculus of human responsibility, and Miss Marple had suggested that Eleanor consider whether her continued silence served anyone's interests, or whether disclosure might not prove ultimately more redemptive for all parties involved. When Sir Frederick had returned to the manor in the late afternoon, Eleanor had met him in the study with an expression of grim resolution, and there had followed a private conversation between husband and wife that no one else had witnessed, but which had apparently consumed several hours, and had proceeded through various emotional registers, from anger to incomprehension, to a kind of exhausted acceptance. By evening, when Miss Marple had taken her leave of the household, the Pembertons had reached a decision of considerable consequence. Eleanor would present herself to the authorities and would provide a complete account of her visit to Dr. Nash's consulting rooms on the afternoon of his death, a disclosure that would necessarily involve acknowledging her violent response to his threats, but which would also clarify the true nature of the doctor's death and the circumstances that had led to his suicide. Sir Frederick had agreed to support his wife in this decision, recognizing that the continued maintenance of silence would ultimately prove far more destructive to the family's cohesion and standing than the truth, however difficult that truth might be in its initial revelation. The following morning brought with it a steady autumn rain that seemed to wash the village with a kind of cleansing purpose, and Miss Marple observed from her sitting-room window the arrival of Eleanor's motor car at the constabulary office in the High Street. She noted the slow, deliberate pace with which Eleanor had emerged from the vehicle accompanied by Mr. Blackwood, and the quality of resigned determination that had characterized Eleanor's bearing as she had entered the police station. By midday, the news had begun to percolate through the village with the inevitable velocity of significant revelation. Eleanor Pemberton had made a statement regarding her presence at Dr. Nash's consulting rooms, had acknowledged striking the doctor in the context of his threats regarding her daughter, and had provided crucial information regarding the actual circumstances of his death. The official determination regarding Dr. Nash's manner of death would remain classified as suicide, the police having determined that Eleanor's blow, while technically an assault, had not constituted a proximate cause of death, and that the doctor's subsequent consumption of the lethal combination of sleeping tablets and whiskey represented a deliberate and intentional act for which Eleanor bore no criminal responsibility. However, Eleanor herself had insisted upon accepting responsibility for her role in the events leading to Dr. Nash's death, and she had been formally charged with assault, a charge that would ultimately be resolved through the magistrate's court with a suspended sentence and a requirement for community service, a resolution that reflected both the mercy of the legal system and the recognition that Eleanor's actions, while violent, had been motivated by legitimate parental protective instinct rather than malice aforethought. The publicity surrounding the matter had been considerable, and for several days Thornbury Village had been consumed with discussion of Eleanor's disclosure, Victoria's hidden past, and the complex web of relationships and motivations that had culminated in Dr. Nash's death. Miss Marple had observed all of this with her characteristic composure, offering neither judgment nor commentary, merely listening to the various interpretations and moral assessments that her neighbors had advanced regarding Eleanor's conduct. It was approximately 1 week following Eleanor's disclosure that Miss Marple received a visitor at her cottage who would provide her with the final piece of information necessary to complete her understanding of the entire sequence of events. Victoria had come to see her, ostensibly to thank her for her role in encouraging her mother to disclose the truth, but in reality to confess something that had been weighing upon her conscience with increasing gravity. Victoria had, she explained, been present in Dr. Nash's consulting rooms on at least one occasion prior to the fatal afternoon, and during that visit she had overheard Dr. N. Ash discussing his financial difficulties with a colleague. She had subsequently taken it upon herself to visit the doctor's office when she knew he would be absent, and she had examined his financial records, searching for some means of understanding the extent of his financial desperation and the likelihood that he would actually carry out his threats regarding her exposure. It was during this examination that Victoria had discovered not merely evidence of Dr. Nash's financial ruin, but also documentation of his affair, letters from the woman with whom he had been involved, and various other materials that had painted a picture of a man spiraling toward complete psychological and financial collapse. Victoria had felt, during that clandestine examination of Dr. Nash's private documents, a kind of terrible pity for the doctor, combined with a recognition that his situation had deteriorated far beyond the point where threats and blackmail would serve any constructive purpose. She had come to understand, with the wisdom that sometimes emerges from youthful observation, that Dr. Nash was not merely a villainous blackmailer, but a profoundly damaged human being engaged in a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to regain control of a life that had fundamentally disintegrated. This understanding had not absolved the doctor of responsibility for his blackmail scheme, but it had provided Victoria with a more complete picture of his motivations and his psychology. Miss Marple had listened to Victoria's confession with her customary attentiveness, and she had observed that Victoria's willingness to acknowledge her own transgression, her unauthorized examination of Dr. Nash's private documents, demonstrated maturity and moral awareness that suggested the young woman would eventually emerge from this crisis with her character substantially strengthened rather than damaged by the experience. The weeks that followed Eleanor's disclosure and Victoria's private confession to Miss Marple brought with them a gradual restoration of equilibrium to Brackendale Manor and indeed to the village of Thornbury itself, though the restoration was of a character considerably more nuanced and complex than simple return to the status quo ante. The scandal that had threatened to engulf the Pemberton family had been substantially mitigated by Eleanor's forthright acknowledgement of her role in the events surrounding Dr. Nash's death, and by the sympathetic response of the village community, which had come to recognize that Eleanor's violent response to the doctor's threats represented an understandable, if legally transgressive, expression of maternal protective instinct. Sir Frederick had stood by his wife throughout the proceedings with a loyalty that had surprised some observers and vindicated others, and the couple had emerged from the ordeal with their marriage substantially strengthened by the crucible through which it had passed. Victoria, freed from the burden of maintaining silence regarding both her past indiscretion and her knowledge of the true circumstances surrounding Dr. Nash's death, had begun a process of genuine emotional and psychological recovery, and she had surprised her parents by expressing a determination to pursue educational opportunities that would have been unthinkable for a young woman of her social position in earlier years. The village itself had undergone a subtle but significant transformation in response to the revelations that had emerged from the investigation into Dr. Nash's death. The comfortable certainties that had characterized Thornbury's social landscape had been destabilized by the recognition that beneath the surface of apparent respectability and stability lay layers of hidden secrets, concealed scandals, and suppressed truths. Mrs. Hartley had confessed to Miss Marple that she found herself viewing her neighbors with considerably more compassion and considerably less certitude regarding their moral standing, recognizing that judgment of others required an understanding of the circumstances and pressures that shaped their behavior. Margaret Castleton, the widow employed at the post office, had remarked to several acquaintances that she had come to appreciate Eleanor's honesty in a way that she had not anticipated, and that Eleanor's willingness to acknowledge her transgression had somehow rendered her more, rather than less, worthy of respect and admiration. Even Mr. Blackwood, the solicitor, had mentioned to colleagues that the Pemberton matter had forced him to reconsider some of his assumptions regarding the relationship between legal culpability and moral responsibility, and that he had developed a considerably more sophisticated understanding of the complexities inherent in the administration of justice. It was on a grey November morning, precisely 1 month following Eleanor's disclosure to the authorities, that Miss Marple received a final visit from Eleanor herself. The older woman had come to Miss Marple's cottage with an expression of quiet gratitude and a determination to express, in person and in private, her appreciation for Miss Marple's role in bringing the matter to its eventual resolution. Eleanor had seated herself in Miss Marple's familiar sitting room, and she had asked directly what had prompted Miss Marple to intervene in the matter, and how Miss Marple had arrived at her understanding of the true nature of Dr. Nash's death when so many others, including the authorities themselves, had been satisfied with the official verdict of suicide. Miss Marple had set aside her knitting with characteristic deliberation, and she had explained, in her gentle and seemingly discursive manner, that she had been struck from the earliest moments of the investigation by certain inconsistencies in the official narrative that could not be readily explained by conventional circumstantial evidence. She had observed that Eleanor's distress on the morning of receiving Dr. Nash's blackmail letter had been of a particular character, suggesting not merely concern about exposure, but guilt regarding some action she feared she had committed or was contemplating committing. Moreover, Miss Marple had continued, she had noted that Sir Frederick's movements on the afternoon of Dr. Nash's death had been observable and accounted for by multiple witnesses, and that while his presence at the consulting rooms might have appeared suspicious, the circumstantial evidence against him was ultimately too convenient, too readily explicable, and too lacking in the messy complications that genuine involvement in such matters typically produced. It was this recognition that had led Miss Marple to consider the possibility that a third party might have been involved in the events surrounding the doctor's death, and Eleanor's elaborate emotional state following Dr. Nash's demise had suggested to Miss Marple that Eleanor might herself be the individual who possessed direct knowledge of the circumstances that had led to the doctor's fatal decision. Miss Marple had explained that she had not accused Eleanor directly, but rather had posed a series of questions and observations designed to allow Eleanor to arrive at her own recognition of the necessity for disclosure, recognizing that true moral resolution could only emerge from Eleanor's own volition rather than from external coercion. Eleanor had listened to this explanation with evident emotion, and she had expressed her understanding that Miss Marple's approach had represented a form of mercy, a recognition that Eleanor's culpability, while real, was fundamentally different in character from intentional murder, and that Eleanor deserved the opportunity to achieve redemption through honest acknowledgement, rather than to remain forever burdened by secret guilt. As Eleanor prepared to depart, Miss Marple had offered her a final observation, one that seemed to crystallize the essential lesson that the entire matter had contained. She had suggested that the tragedy surrounding Dr. Nash's death had ultimately resulted not from any single individual's deliberate malice, but rather from the accumulated weight of secrets, the burden of concealment, and the isolation that comes when individuals attempt to protect themselves and their loved ones through deception rather than honesty. Dr. Nash's blackmail had emerged not from wickedness but from desperation. Eleanor's violence had emerged not from cruelty but from the desperation of maternal protection, and Victoria's concealment had emerged from love rather than from malice. The true moral of the affair, Miss Marple had observed with characteristic wisdom, was that communities, like families, could only function with integrity when individuals possessed the courage to acknowledge their truths, their vulnerabilities, and their imperfections, and that the pursuit of reputation at the expense of honesty ultimately led only to the kind of tragedy that had consumed Dr. Nash, and had nearly consumed the Pemberton family as well.